Success at the UN Climate Conference. Delegates from nearly 200 countries reach an agreement aimed at putting the Paris Accord to limit global warming into action. Hello, I'm Arvind Naidu, and this is The Heat. The deal, which was reached in Poland, sets rules on how every country measures, reports and verifies efforts to cut emissions, implementing the 2015 Paris Agreement. The delegates delayed decisions on carbon credits after objections from Brazil and failed to get firm commitments from countries to do even more to reduce emissions. Still, negotiators say the agreement is an important step.
With approximately 200 countries in the room, it is not easy to find agreement on a deal so specific and so technical. But in these circumstances, every single step forward is a big achievement. And through this package, you have made 1,000 little steps forward together. You can feel proud.
For more on what was accomplished at the UN Climate Conference, let's bring in our panel. Joining us now from Warsaw, Poland, via Skype is Lall. She's the China Program Manager with the Global Green Growth Institute. From Seattle, Barbara Finamore is the founder of the China Program at the Natural Resources Defense Council and author of Will China Save the Planet? Also with us is Upmanu Lall. He's the director of the Columbia Water Center at Columbia University in New York. And Paul Bledsoe is a strategic advisor with the Progressive Policy Institute and president of Bledsoe and Associates right here in Washington, D.C. Thanks to all of you for joining us. Barbara Finamore, let me start with you in Seattle. As we just heard, it's very difficult to get 200 countries to agree on an agreement on measures to limit climate change. But looking at this conference, what do you think it achieved?
It achieved basically what it set out to do. When the Paris Agreement was found in 2015, the countries agreed that they needed to set the detailed rules of the road for how to operationalize all the historic commitments that were made. So that was the major focus of the conference this year. And the delegates did, in fact, achieve hundreds of pages of very detailed rules that are going to determine how countries are making progress in meeting their Paris commitments and holding each other accountable for that. Also, detailed rules for developed countries providing climate finance to developing countries. And there was language there about how every single country needs to step up its ambition in fighting climate change, especially in the light of the very alarming UN reports that have come out recently on how fast climate change is moving.
Barbara, just one point on holding countries accountable. This is not a legally binding agreement, so how do you hold countries accountable?
Right. Well, that's right. Every country has the opportunity and the commitment to live up to its pledges, but the rules require that they have to report on what they're doing every 2 years in detail, a great deal of detail. And they must open their books to international monitors and to a multilateral process that is going to make it clear whether what they are reporting is the same as the atmosphere is seeing. And if it's not, then there is a process in these rules for holding countries accountable and making sure that they live up to those commitments and provide all the necessary data to enable countries to make sure that they are doing what they said they would do.
Lall, we just heard Barbara Finamore refer to that report that came out a couple of months ago in October, that scientific panel that reported to the United Nations. It painted a very bleak picture of efforts so far to limit greenhouse gases, a bleak picture in the fight against climate change. Given that, and given that there were so many reservations expressed by some of the delegates at the conference that took place in Poland, did you sense an urgency on the part of delegates at this conference to implement the Paris Accord?
I think countries are aware of the climate crisis, but some may have suffering more than others, so they are more aware of it. So there's a different level of awareness among countries. For example, least developed countries, small island countries, they are more aware of it, but some may not. Therefore, we see there's a lack of enough political ambitions to tackle the climate emergency worldwide.
Upmanu, Lall, I just want to take a step back here. And if we look at the long-term goal of the Paris Accord, it was to keep the increase in global temperatures to well below 2 degrees Celsius above pre-industrial levels. Now, this conference, to a certain extent, was a reiteration of that goal, but we did hear a very dire warning from the United Nations Secretary General, Antonio Guterres. Let's listen to part of what he had to say.
To waste this opportunity in Katowice would compromise our last best chance to stop runaway climate change. It would not only be immoral, it would be suicidal.
So, Upmanu, Lall, listening to that sounds very alarming, but what kind of progress did you see?
I'm not sure that I saw concrete progress. As Barbara said, it's great that these guys got together and they have an agreement. But as was also observed by Ella, what we have seen in the UN report and what we have seen in specific countries other than China really is not a tremendous amount of progress in the last several years. We've gone to a situation where there was a lot of dialogue. There continues to be a lot of dialogue and a limited amount of action, which is largely coming on renewable energies because of China's initiatives.
Paul, we've just had some numbers come out. Where do we stand right now?
Well, it's important to recognize that after 3 years in the middle of this decade where global emissions held steady, they're now spiking back up again. Emissions last year globally grew 2%. In 2018, they're going to grow 3%. Chinese emissions in 2018 will be up 5%. And for the first time in almost a generation, U.S. emissions will be up almost 3%. So we have to recognize that we're losing the battle with climate change right now. The UN IPCC report you referenced noted that we have to peak global emissions by 2020 to be on a trajectory to reduce them enough to zero emissions by mid-century to keep warming under 1.5 or 2 degrees Celsius. So we are not even close to meeting the goals of the Paris Agreement. In fact, even if we met all the pledges the Paris Agreement sets out, warming would increase to 3.5 degrees Celsius above pre-industrial levels. So it's important to recognize that we are way behind on this issue. And that's why I think that so many people were frustrated by the outcomes in Poland. Barbara's exactly right, that the conference was set out to achieve the rules. But the truth is also that the very countries that have signed up to their pledges are not on pace to meet them. And what this means is we are headed toward a planet, a hothouse planet of runaway climate change. The IPCC report also said that unless we make peak total emissions by 2020 and reduce very rapidly thereafter, there's a possibility of runaway cascading climate change, which will inflict hundreds of billions of dollars of annual costs, many of which we're already seeing, and destabilize entire populations and countries. I'm not sure global leaders really quite understand how close a catastrophe is.
Barbara, what is your assessment? As Paul says, runaway cascading climate change. That's what we're going to be facing.
That's right. And this latest report from the UN shows there is an enormous difference between an increase of 1.5 degrees and 2 degrees in terms of every aspect of our life on Earth, including more severe wildfires, hurricanes, droughts, desertification, water shortages, you name it, destruction of coral reefs, habitat loss. It's really essential now for every country to do what they agreed to do at this latest COP conference, which is to go back home and begin immediately, if they haven't already, a comprehensive and inclusive process that involves every stakeholder in their country in developing more ambitious goals that they then must bring to the special conference next September that the UN Secretary General is holding. There is no time to waste on this. A number of countries have already begun the process, and there's a high ambition coalition that is determined to push countries on this, but it's now going back to each individual country. That's where the action is going forward, and that's where the pressure needs to be put on.
Upmanu, Lall, if we look at the impact that climate change is having, it's already having an effect on the planet. I mean, we look at things like prolonged droughts, water shortages, record-breaking temperatures, melting ice, the destruction of coral reefs, things like that. But on the crucial question of water security, and that's your specialty, let's take a country like China. How is China coping with that?
So I'll start by saying that in many ways, I think using temperature as a gauge of climate change is a terrible idea, because people think, well, there are warmer places I can live there and so on, whereas water is really where many of the impacts go through. And that's true, that has been true in China historically as well. If you look at extremes of climate, floods and droughts, China, South Asia, the parts, northern part of Africa, all of these regions have experienced significant impacts of climate extremes, which then get exacerbated. And this is the part that we forget, because climate is a long-term view. And if you, for example, if I look in the United States, the longest drought, most severe, longest drought in the United States happened in the 13th century and lasted for 27 years and covered nearly most of the country. If I now come back and look at what we are facing today, we don't have a memory of such events. So we don't really understand that the changes that we are seeing could be harbingers of what we have seen in the past and how we deal with it. In the case of China, what I would say is that China has built a substantial amount of infrastructure on both water storage and wastewater capture. And China leads the world in terms of, in the most recent period, transitions towards sustainability on water. So I'm less concerned about China's water security in the face of climate change than I am of much of the rest of the world, including the United States.
Ella Wang, I'm wondering how much of this is a dilemma for developing countries. Of course, there is apprehension in developing countries over implementing the Paris Accord. There are a number of countries, developing countries, who feel that this could hinder economic growth. China, for one, has sought to reassure those countries, like itself. It's also other developing countries, that this is something that can be done. Both things can be done. Let's listen to an excerpt from that.
This indicates that multilateralism is effective, and we need multilateralism to solve global issues. We think this conference is successful, and we have successfully fulfilled the task assigned by our country.
So, Ella, can both things be done? How much of a challenge is it for developing countries to meet those targets without hurting their economic growth?
I think there are indeed a lot of challenges for developing countries. For example, we see from the COP24, China has been standing with developing countries to demand for example, more finance support from developed countries so that they can build up their own capacity and also do the, for example, renewables industry development. But still, this is something hasn't been fully resolved. So we see China has been a tough negotiator in the international process. But at the same time, China and other developing countries also see it has to be supportive to the international climate regime. So there could be a strong rule book to optionalize the Paris Agreement. So we see that there's like a balance in developing countries in there. And also domestically, it's not easy for developing countries to do, for example, energy transformation. I think China has been doing great in this area. For example, the coal consumption has been reduced from more than 70% to 60%. And also the renewables industry has been developed quite fast in China. Actually, China has been the top one worldwide on renewables, particularly solar, wind. But I think other developing countries may still need more resource or support from other countries to develop their own renewables industries and also doing their own energy transformation, energy transition. I think North-South cooperation and also South-South cooperation will be crucial to support developing countries to do the energy transition. For example, China has been offering South-South cooperation support to other developing countries.
Yeah.
And also, I think non-state actors are also promoting this as well.
Paul, you mentioned the United States earlier on. The United States didn't attend this conference in Poland, a smaller delegation. It didn't dissent from the final agreement, despite the fact that Donald Trump has pledged to pull out of the Paris Agreement. Does that encourage you?
I'm afraid it really doesn't. There are two layers to the U.S. response. There's the career civil servants who have the technical expertise to help the world get these rules, and they did their jobs. But in the political side, obviously, we have Donald Trump, who has denied climate change science and is standing in the way of global action. We have to step back and realize that it's going to take the world's largest nations and their leaders coming together to actually get a handle on global emissions. Let's look at history. When we had the ozone hole, the major nations came together, including the United States and Britain, Reagan and Thatcher, and got the Montreal Protocol to reduce those super pollutants. By the way, that was the most effective climate treaty in history as well. Then President Obama and President Xi in 2013 came together and decided to reduce super pollutants, HFCs, which are thousands of times more powerful than CO2. That led to the Kigali Agreement. Then Obama and Xi came together again in 2015 and both announced cuts in greenhouse gas emissions across the board, including CO2. That led to the Paris Agreement. We have to recognize that it is the top global leaders who set the agenda. So I look to Prime Minister Modi, President Macron, obviously President Xi, and others to meet without Donald Trump at this point. If they're going to meet with anyone in the United States, they should meet with the dozens of governors who are helping take action, the newly elected House Democrats who are having a very ambitious plan. American businesses have a very ambitious plan. The truth is, Donald Trump does not speak for American society. I think he only speaks for a small subset of climate change deniers. I also think that ultimately he will lose election partly on this issue in 2020 as American voters see huge climate change impacts that have cost hundreds of billions of dollars just in the last 2 years affect their own lives.
Barbara, as you pointed out earlier on, we have global leaders, of course, making these agreements. We get joint communiques coming out of meetings. But now the delegates go back to their countries. They've got to look at these rules, and they've got to abide by the rules. But how hard is it for them to sell this to their populations?
I think the rules did a very good job of, first of all, setting forth a single system for reporting on emissions, on climate finance, of evaluating where their emission trajectories were going and so forth. But they also provided flexibility for developing countries that need it in terms of their own circumstances. So they are given extra time if they can make the case why they need it. And then the climate finance piece is exceptionally important because hopefully it will provide opportunities to help build the capacity of those countries to do those reports and to fulfill their pledges. Now, I think in terms of selling this, in developing countries, it's important to note that almost all of the countries that are going to be affected most by climate change are in Africa and in Asia. And that's already happening now. And most of the cities that are going to be affected the most are the fastest growing cities in these developing countries. And so I think it's important to get the word out in terms of how climate change is already affecting each and every country and is projected to affect each and every country. And that, I think, is going to make a big difference. The other thing that's going to make a big difference, of course, is that the energy transition has really been accelerated by China's own massive investments in solar and wind that are projected to be among the cleanest sources of energy, cheapest sources of energy, in as little as 5 years. So once that happens, and it's already starting to happen, it's going to be less of a hard sell to countries and more of a sound economic decision. So again, I think what's needed going forward is particular attention to countries that haven't done the research necessary to see how that clean energy revolution that China is spearheading can be in their own best economic and environmental and climate interest.
Upmanu, Lall, if we listen to some of the discourse about climate change here in the United States, there appears to be sometimes a tendency for people to believe that climate change is something that happens in other parts of the world. It doesn't happen in the United States. And as Paul just pointed out a moment ago, we could soon see the impact of climate change right here in this country. In fact, the U.S. Environmental Protection Agency, and this is getting back to something that you would know a lot about, it says that climate change is changing U.S. assumptions on water resources. What is the water security outlook for a country like the United States?
It's not great. There are two reasons for that. One is that we are experiencing more extremes, more persistent droughts, and the nature of these droughts is different from the droughts of the past. Because of warmer temperatures, the soil gets drier quickly and the soil's moisture holding capacity decreases. So this translates into much greater irrigation water requirements, especially in areas where we are already water stressed. And agriculture is a big part of the economy, or at least the activity in terms of what goes on for the food production of the country. The other part is that the United States and Europe have aging water infrastructure, old dams that are likely to fail because they have not been maintained, levees similarly, and pipes and sewers that are 75 to 100 years old. And so if you look at it, we face a double whammy in the United States. The aging infrastructure is projected to cost nearly $1 trillion just to replace in the form that it was already in. That doesn't account for destruction of that infrastructure that may take place because of extreme climate events. So in the context of water security, the United States becomes quite a worrisome place because the fragility of the infrastructure and the climate extremes come together to create a situation that will be very hard to finance and recover from.
Ella Wang, some of the most urgent appeals we've heard for the world to act on climate change has come from the leaders of island nations. And of course, these island nations, as we know, are very vulnerable to rising ocean levels. We heard this warning from Mohammed Nasheed. He's the former president of the Maldives. Let's listen to what he had to say.
We are not winning the battle. Half of the problem is that we are still begging the big polluters to stop polluting on ethical grounds. But they are not listening to us. They never were. So instead, rather than asking for cuts, perhaps we should be demanding an increase in investments in clean energy.
So, Ella, we hear the frustration there. We hear the deep concern on the part of Nasheed Mohammed. What about that proposal that he's making, more investments in clean energy?
I think that's a very legitimate suggestion. We see that climate vulnerables are demanding leadership from the international society, and this is something that countries can really support. So we see that China has been offering South-South cooperation, particularly on renewables investment within China and also along Belt and Road countries. So I think in that way, if we can boost the renewables industry in other countries, in developing countries, when they can build up their own renewable industry in their own countries, they have better chance to meet their commitment and also help to accelerate energy transition in their countries so that to tackle the climate crisis worldwide.
Paul, what are some of the markers that we should be looking for in the months and years ahead to tell us progress is either being made or it's not being made?
It's a great question. Elle is exactly right. We have the technologies to reduce emissions. China has made major investments, so has the United States private sector. The costs of wind and solar have gone down 80% in 10 years, a remarkable change. Now we need political will to create laws that put incentives to deploy this energy instead of continuing to use fossil fuels. What we lack in every major country in the world, and it's important to remember that China, the US, and the EU alone account for half of emissions, and the top 20 emitters account for more than 80% of emissions. So the developed world and China have to lead the way here. We can do it, we have the technologies, but we have to put certain specific policies in place. Those policies include the pricing of carbon so that it's more expensive to pollute than it is to use clean, zero-emission energy. We have to put subsidies toward the creation of even greater technologies to get emissions to zero, and those include electricity storage that would allow us to use clean energy around the clock rather than only when the sun shines or the wind blows. And then finally, I think we have to recognize that the costs of climate change impacts are going to be so much higher than the costs of reducing them that we have to do everything quickly. And here, specifically, it turns out that half the warming that's going to occur in the next 20 years is not CO2. It's not emissions from energy use. It's from black carbon, it's from methane, it's from HFCs, it's the short-lived so-called super pollutants. Right. Turns out that if we cut those super pollutants aggressively, we can reduce warming over the next 30 years even more than the cuts in CO2. So we have to do both types of aggressive cuts, CO2 and super pollutants, to address the problem.
That's where we are going to have to leave it. Thanks to all of you for being with us. That's it for this edition of The Heat. I'm Anand Naidu in Washington, D.C. Thanks for being with us.